Hi, I'm Phil Ball, pastor of Odyssey Christian Church in Jenks, Oklahoma. We're part of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, and we offer a non-judgmental approach to support your personal journey of faith. After the message, we invite you to keep listening for a presentation from our wonderful band. And if you want to experience worship live, we invite you to find out all the details at www.facebook.com/Odyssey CC.
Being the 4th of July stuff, there's a thing among theologians that talk about a national religion and how much heresy that is, where we associate Christianity with America and America with Christianity, and as if that was, that would have been fine in 1955, but it doesn't work anymore. And I'm not even going to talk about that other than to mention it because this is different. I wanted to contrast. What I'm trying to get at is how I think God moves through history in all of our lives, but particularly even with nations, to bring about a new hope and new possibility. And I do believe that America has served that role in world history for some time, because it was a new vision that was happening. And really, the revolution that happened in what became the United States in the late 1700s also happened in France. And it was just, there's other things going on where God was moving through history to move society toward, hopefully, a more redemptive structure of government. But I've been interested in American history and history in general from an early age. I don't know why, it just rang in me. And so I've been around it a lot, I've studied it a lot, I've watched it a lot, and the same thing with the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament stuff. That kind of stuff is really fascinating, and I've read a lot of archaeology and different things about that. And in all of it, I've kind of noticed a pattern, particularly in the text, is that God doesn't restrict God's will and movement to religious organizations, to one particular religion, to one doctrine, or to just secular movements. God moves people from where they are to where they might experience new possibilities. And in the process, we learn faith. Because most of the time when God's moving us, we're going, wait a minute, I didn't want to go there. And things just keep happening. One of the good things that came out of Saddleback Church is they talked about that God seemed to move in trendy waves, and I don't mean trendy like style, but in waves through history. And to catch one of those waves and to figure out where God was going was a real helpful thing as a church. Most of the time the church is about, in my opinion, 5 miles behind the wave going, what was that? But here we are, we're in a revolutionary process of God's action in history. And I'm convinced that for us to get it in our heads that it's rarely clean, easy, or without high levels of resistance from anyone who has a vested interest in keeping things the way they were or are. Most people like to have their heartfelt ideas, perceptions, or social glue that they've come to depend on challenged or threatened in any way. And I believe that God does that frequently. That's what I read in the Bible. That's the things that keep coming through to me. And that I believe God has called us to adopt a radical faith that includes an attitude that basically says, wow, there's a radical change going on and may occur in my life or our society or our nation or our world, and I'm not sure what it's all about, but I just wonder what God is trying to do with us and for us, not to us. Because there's Old Testament stuff to where God's always doing something to us because we weren't faithful. And I think Jesus changed all that. So I need to say that from both the Big Bang story of science and how we've evolved to the story and the second creation story about the divine breath, the pneuma, that took a lump of clay and breathed life into it. God is always continually creating and making something out of nothing and breathing into a figure of lifeless clay. I think that God chose Noah at one point in history to move civilization from one place to the next. And I don't want to talk about that, but I'm trying to call your attention to those stories in the Bible where this kind of movement happens. And then after God figured out that He couldn't deal with all of humanity because He wiped them all out, He says, I'm not doing that anymore. Then in chapter 12 of Genesis, God goes, I'm going to pick one dude. And so He picked Abram. And He went to specific. And all the rest of the book of Genesis, from chapter 12 to chapter 50, is all about Abram and his offspring. and that extended family. And so then that happens. And Abram really is such a great example of our journey, of what it means to be called. You know, Abram, go to a land that I will show you in chapter 12, to where in chapter 15, only 3 chapters later, he's going, what? It's like, you promised me all this stuff. I don't even have children. And I love how he says that. But Abram said, O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. What a name is that? No, he didn't say that, but I did. And then Abraham said, you have given me no offspring, and so a slave born in my house is to be my heir. I see no evidence of your promise. And I think that that's where we are in our journey of faith a lot of times. It's just hard to see that. But I think that there's a pattern in this story and in all these stories in which God moves through these revolutionary tactics to bring new stuff to happen. It seems to me that we humans, it's our natural tendency to respond with some degree of fear and uncertainty when God's revealing God's presence and moving us along. Now, you'd think that it's all just kind of cuddly and nice and warm because God's that way, but I think that what with the story we get, and what I think is that that throughout the Bible, throughout those stories, there's all this struggle, and I see that in giving birth, that is a difficult struggle. I mean, I've lived with 3 pregnancies and with women, and it's not an easy journey a lot of times. It's a difficult journey. And I think that that's what it means to go through that journey of giving birth. And I think that, like we were talking about with play, we will play until we die. We human creatures are those who will play until we die if we allow that to move through us, if we don't try to grow out of it and repress it and push it down. Well, we will grow until we die. You know, there are people in your life or that you know who have not given up until they died. And they didn't just buy it all out. One of the frustrations, honestly, I had with my father is I felt like he abandoned himself before he was physically dead. But, you know, it was his life. I couldn't beat him up for it, but I was frustrated. I made a commitment that I wasn't going to do that. And I think God's always moving with us in those ways. But also God moves with a greater part of it. So what I want to do is I want to lift up the idea that God is moving through history and was moving in America from the Jamestown settlement in 1607 to the Continental Congress in 1775. And that's the part I kind of want to look at. And we're not going to deal with much with any of the stuff before 1773, but I want us to look at some stuff, particularly look at the events leading up to the American Revolution, because most of the time those are gone, in my experience, those are skipped over pretty fast. So I'm going to tell you in advance, okay, now get this. This is the only part I want you to for sure get. That there are more pieces of information I'm getting to tell you that you will ever remember. I do not expect you to remember it. There will not be a test. You get free ice cream just by sitting here. It's all good, but I want to just dump out a bunch of stuff, and I want you to let it just wash over you. And what I want you to look at is how God is moving a nation, a group of people, 13, give or take, colonies that don't have any relationship to each other legally, except that they're British colonies. And I want you to watch how in the process, God starts to form them and pull them together and then continue their life afterwards. And it's just the most interesting feel. I want you to get a feel for how things seem to move. And then at some point, hopefully when you leave here, you'll go, I wonder how God's working with us now. Because that's my point, is that God is continually moving through history to pick us up and to journey us and move us along. So God's movement through history is not easy, it's clean, it's not organized, it's not pleasant, but it's the very nature of the birth process, okay? Now, there you go. I'd like you to image in your brain a horizontal line. I did not put one on the screen, but that moves from left to right, and you put in your brain 1763 on the left, and let it go to 1775. Those are the years we're going to look at, and not every year of those, but we're going to kind of move through to see the kind of things that were happening that led up to. And 1775 was when the first battle of the Revolutionary War happened. It was Lexington and Concord. It wasn't a big battle, but it was when most history people say that's when it started and broke out into conflict. But here's the thing. At the end of 1763, they ended the French and Indian War, okay? And the Treaty of Paris ended that. And the British had spent a lot of money trying to win that war and make it all happen. And like any normal big bureaucratic government that's how far is England from the United States? Is it 2,000 miles? How far is the Atlantic? Anybody know? Nobody knows. Somebody will look it up on their phone. I'm not asking you to, but it's a long way off, okay? And it took 3 months to sail back and forth. And so you've got a bureaucratic government, and they say, you know, those American colonies, they're colonies. We own them. They need to be paying for this war. Makes good sense, doesn't it? Except that if you're an American, you're over here and you're going, we're English, but we've busted our butt to make this place happen, and we're not going to pay all that stuff they want us to pay. So that's kind of what we started getting into. This financially draining war combined with increased military presence. They decided to do that. So the first thing they did was in 1764, and they put the Grenville Acts up that passed in Parliament, and they were aimed at raising the revenue to pay for this, along with war debts and administration. But the most objectionable part of it to the colonists was the Sugar Act. And it would increase duties on items ranging from sugar to coffee to textiles. And I would say we have a long national tradition of resenting the tax man. And in April of that year, the Currency Act passed Parliament. This is all 1764. And they prohibited the colonies from issuing legal tender. They wanted to keep it in control of England. And in Boston, a town meeting protested those measures, and a guy named James Otis first discusses the complaint of taxation without representation and calls for the colonies to unite. So you're starting to see in 1764, how many years before this movement is starting, like 10, 15 years. Okay, it's moving on. So the Massachusetts House of Representatives, and this is really cool, does a committee of correspondence to communicate with the other colonies about all of our common grievances. So that there's this formation that's kind of starting. Okay? And in August, Boston merchants began a policy of non-importation of British luxury goods as a form of protest against these British economic policies, and it later spreads to all of the colonies. Now that was 64. In 65, the Stamp Act passes Parliament. The first direct tax on the colonies. The purpose is to help pay for the British military station. And they get more taxation without representation stuff. And then the Quartering Act goes on. Okay, it's 3,000 miles. Dan looked it up. The Quartering Act goes on, which means that British troops are quartered in your house. So instead of, when you build a new house, building a room for your mother-in-law, you build them for a British troop. Okay, they have to live there. And Patrick Henry begins a discussion of Virginia resolutions asserting that only Virginia has the right to tax itself, not the king. Now, where did they get this? The Sons of Liberty in July of 1765. The Sons of Liberty organized and found in towns across all the colonies to fight against the stamp agents. And usually they're like terrorists. They would actually be violent to these stamp agents that are going around with this stamp law. And so then this Congress occurs in October, where in New York City, and includes representatives from 9 colonies who petition against this old Stamp Act, and it's sent to King George III saying that we think this is not a good thing. And to the effect, in November the 1st, the Stamp Act goes into effect, and all business in the colonies basically stops because the colonists refuse to use the stamps. Now, when has the United States ever done anything as one unit before, since, we're stopping by this stuff, all commerce is going to stop against this Stamp Act? Well, in 1766, Ben Franklin testifies before English Parliament about the Stamp Act and warns that if military is used to enforce it, it could lead to open rebellion. And that's 10 years before, almost 9 years before this ever happens. Now, here again, there's no test on this. I want you to listen and watch this roll, watch this happen. In 1767, the Townshend Act passed Parliament. A number of external taxes, duties on things like paper, glass, tea, And then an infrastructure is set up to enforce these taxes in America. Boston decides to reinstate the non-importation of British goods, and they do some other stuff. And in 68, Sam Adams sends a letter with a six-pack of beer to get the Massachusetts Assembly to argue against the Townshend Acts, and the letter is protested by the British government. Increasing number of legislative assemblies support Sam Adams, and he sends them free beer. After a confrontation over customs violation, John Hancock's ship, the Liberty, is seized in Boston. Customs officials are threatened with violence and escape to a castle, which they send out a request for help, so British troops come to Boston. By the way, Massachusetts was a hotbed of all this. They finally got English general just took over Massachusetts and just ticked off everybody. 2 British regiments in October of 68 arrived to help support the customs officials and enforce customs law. Okay, that's 68. 69, a growing number of key merchants support non-importation of goods. George Washington presents non-importation resolutions to the Virginia House of Burgesses. Proclamations are sent out from Patrick Henry, and I love this name. This is a great Southern name. Richard Henry Lee. Now, doesn't that sound like an aristocrat? Okay. To King George III, basically they're just really ticked off at this whole operation. And on March the 5th, the Boston Massacre occurs, killing 5 colonists and injuring 6, but is used as a big propaganda piece, okay? The English crown partially repeals the Townshend Acts, but Boston town meetings led by Sam Adams results in a 21-member committee of correspondence to cooperate with other Massachusetts towns against the threat to self-rule. So 1773, the Tea Act goes into effect, retaining the import tax on tea, giving the East India Company the ability to undersell all colonial merchants. The Boston Tea Party occurs. After months of growing consternation of the Tea Act, a group of Boston activists dressed as Mohawk Indians boarded ships anchored in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 casks of tea into the water. Now, that was a night's work. So that's all of 73. 74, the colonists except North Carolina and Pennsylvania have created committees of correspondence. Now, you see how everybody's pulling it together? Coercive acts passed Parliament. And there's all these different things. A Boston Port Bill, which does not allow any shipping except for military supplies and other approved cargo to go through the port until all the custom duties and the cost of the tea has been paid for. So General Thomas Gage, commander of all British forces in America, arrives in Boston and then later takes over. He begins to be the Massachusetts general and running all of Massachusetts, because Massachusetts is later said that they are in non-compliance as being a colony. Then in 1774, the First Continental Congress adopts the Declaration of Resolves Against Coercive Acts, the Quebec Act, the quartering of troops, and other objectionable actions. And these resolutions include the rights of colonists, including life, liberty, and property. Then Thomas Paine moves to America. Okay. And in 1775, declarations and resolves are presented to Parliament. Massachusetts is declared in a state of rebellion. The Parliament accepts a conciliatory plan, but Patrick Henry gives his famous "Give me liberty or give me death" speech in the Virginia Convention, and the Crown does a restraining order for Virginia. Then the General Gage in Massachusetts is ordered to use any force necessary to apply all British acts and to stop any buildup of the colonial militia. And on April the 18th and 19th, we had the Battle of Lexington and Concord. Whew. But can you see the movement? Can you see how one thing builds on the next and all this forces? And it's bigger than any one person. It's larger. And that's why I say that I believe that God's Spirit is somehow moving through it to help something happen. And this painting by John Turnbull is really shows the drafting committee presenting its work of the drafting of the Declaration of Independence. And I'm going to tell you some characteristics about the Declaration of Independence that I never learned, and I figure if I never learned them, maybe you didn't. I don't mean to be arrogant about that, but I want to tell you some stuff because it represents an attitude on the part of the leaders that have emerged out of this whole conflict to where they work together. They figure out how to help each other. There's some really smart people, and I want you to pay attention to this. One of those widely held misconceptions is that the Declaration of Independence was signed on the 4th. Well, in fact, it was not signed until much later. But it was formally declared on July the 2nd, a date John Adams believed would be the most memorable epoch in the history of America. But they approved it on the 4th, and the final text of the Declaration wasn't signed until August the 2nd. And a guy named Robert Livingston, now this is so cool. Robert Livingston, one of the members of the committee who wrote the Declaration of Independence, never signed it because he believed that it was too soon to declare independence and therefore refused to sign. Okay? But while he stood for his beliefs, he didn't vote no every time anything ever happened. You know, it's like he hung in there with it. After Jefferson wrote his first draft of the Declaration, other members of the Declaration and the Committee and the Continental Congress made 86 changes to it. I love that business. Including shortening the overall length by more than a fourth, like y'all would like to do with this sermon. Jefferson was quite unhappy about some of the edits made to his original draft of the Declaration, so he took his toys and went home. No, he didn't. He had originally included language condemning the British promotion of the slave trade, even though he himself was a slave owner. This criticism of the slave trade was removed in spite of Jefferson's objections. So, you know, there's this thing about all this. And some of the most famous lines in the Declaration of Independence were inspired by Virginia's Declaration of Rights by George Mason. And George Mason was a really important figure in this whole process. And we don't ever hear that. I mean, you know, I don't ever hear that before. 9 of the signers of the Declaration of Independence died before the end of the war. Okay, so there's this process that goes on, and we may not see the fruition of it, but we participate in the steps of it. And it's important to do that, so that the end of real big conflicts for the War of Independence ended in 1781. And if you read the statistics on it, there's almost as many French troops as there were American colonists that were over against the British, because Ben Franklin had done his work and had gotten the French to support this whole process, so that it was this big thing. Okay, now there's some characters I wanted to point out, because my convention to you is that it didn't just start a revolution. Then you had to have somebody complete it. You had to have somebody finish it, somebody establish a new country. And I just see God's hand through this. And that's what I want to draw your attention to. God provided the leaders of the American colonies to carry this young, vulnerable nation to a solid government with positive foundation for growth following the War of Independence. Now I'm going to start on your lower left and work up that side. Then I'm going to start on your lower right and work up that side. And the last dude is in the middle because I'd never heard of him before, and I think he's significant, and you need to know his name. God's influence extends beyond just religious practice or religious categories, and it moves all in there. That could have fallen apart after a revolution. We know that that's already happened in Iraq. Okay, it's just fallen apart because they did not have the leadership to put their government together so that it included everybody. Now that's just my opinion, and you can disagree with that. I'm not going to fuss with you. George Washington was a member of the First Continental Congress, chosen to lead the Revolutionary Army, President of the Constitutional Convention, and of course became the first President of the United States. In all these leadership positions, he showed a steadfastness of purpose and helped create precedents and foundations that would help form America. That's why he's so important. John Adams, you cannot underestimate the importance or overestimate the importance of John Adams. He was important in the First and Second Continental Congresses. He was on the committee that drafted the Declaration of Independence. He was central to its adoption. Because of his foresight, George Washington was named commander of the Continental Army. at the Second Continental. Adams was chosen to help negotiate the Treaty of Paris in 1783 that finished the War of Independence. He later became the first vice president and then the second president of the United States. Jefferson was a delegate, and all that stuff we've talked about. He was unanimously picked to write the Declaration. He was sent to France as a diplomat after the Revolution and returned to become the first vice president under John Adams and then the third president. James Madison, father of the Constitution, for he was responsible for writing much of it. John Jay and Alexander Hamilton, he was one of the authors of the Federalist Papers that helped persuade the states to accept the new Constitution. You know, it didn't just get railroaded. It wasn't a dictatorship. You had to get everybody to buy into it. And the fact that they bought into it, I think, is another sign of God's movement. The Bill of Rights were added because of James Madison and stuff, and as well as things. Ben Franklin was involved. He was an elder statesman. He was central to getting French aid during the Revolution, and he also helped negotiate the Treaty of Paris that ended the war. Alexander Hamilton, for me, he wrote Federalist Papers that helped pull together so that it was a central government. That's what the struggle, one of the earliest struggles was, is for the colonies to give up their power to a central government. And all this had to happen so that we could move forward. But it did happen. But Hamilton was made the first Secretary of the Treasury, and he was so important because of that. Now, the last guy there, a guy named, I'm not sure if he was a governor, Gouverneur, or is that his first name? You all tell me. And his last name was Morris. He was an accomplished statesman that ushered in the idea of a person being a citizen of the Union, not just a citizen of an individual colony or state. He was part of the Second Continental Congress and helped provide legislative leadership to back up George Washington in his fight against the British. He signed the Articles of Confederation. He's credited with writing parts of the Constitution, possibly the preamble. Okay, now you can rest. It's the last slide. Now I bring it back to faith. Abram is on the journey. We're all on the journey. And in Genesis 15, this is the text. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. Now, my computer Bible tells me that the phrase, do not be afraid, occurs more than 445 times in the Bible. And that's more than enough for each one of us to say it every day for a year and still not exhaust all the do not be afraids that are in the text. Because God is constantly saying, I know this just scares the bejeebers out of you. Don't be afraid. You're moving. You're growing. You're going through stuff. You haven't died yet. You're still on the track. And God is out to move us. God is our shield and will enable us to transform death into life. And I'm going to leave you from a quote from the book of Revelation. It's the next to last chapter in the last book of the Bible. And this is something that can ring through your head. And the one who was seated on the throne said, see, I am making all things new. And he also said, write this, for these words are trustworthy and true. So my call to you on this celebration of God's movement in history and continuing movement in history is to look to our lives so that what God is continually doing will be that which makes all things new. Let us pray. Dear God, we come to you sometimes questioning whether or not things are new or not, and questioning whether or not you really are having your hand in it, that you have a mighty hand involved in these things. But as acts of radical faith, we claim that you are. We claim that you will be with us. We claim that your love will sustain us. We claim that we do not need to be afraid, and we give you thanks. Amen.
This is another song that includes David Crosby. Teach your children well.